Welcome to Cambridge Geopolitics Conversations and to this podcast series on resistance, radicalisation and religion, where we'll be looking at division and extremism in different parts of the world and in history. I'm Suzanne Raine and I'm joined today by Professor Ali Ansari of the University of St Andrews, who is an expert on modern Iran with a particular interest in nationalism and political development. He's currently on a fellowship at the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and is here speaking in a personal capacity. Ali, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So let's start. The subject of this podcast might have been tailor-made for a discussion on modern Iranian history. Could we start by looking at the revolution of 1979, which saw the overthrow of the Shah and with it a turning away from Western, particularly British and American, influence and interference? Was that a question of taking back control?
Well, I suppose, yes. To coin a phrase, it was in one sense. Iran has had two significant political revolutions in the 20th century. Both were attempts by the people or the political elites in one form or another to take back control of the state, but also in some ways, certainly in 1979, to take back, in a sense, a control from what they perceived to be Western interference, particularly that of the United States in 79. And I think a much more sort of deeper underlying motive was this idea that the Iranian state had declined in its sort of power, prestige, status over the previous 200 years. And this was an attempt to sort of reboot it, if you will. So there were a variety of different motives. Obviously, religion played a fairly important role in that desire to restate their sort of their position. But there were other factors involved, obviously.
So let's dig a little deeper into that, because it's exactly that question about what the different motives were and how the people organising the resistance or revolution, how they used those motives to mobilise a population. So given, it'd be really, really interesting to sort of hear you talk about those different aspects. So was it more a case of religious identity or was it national identity? Have they always been intertwined? And given that the central tenet of the revolution was that it was an Islamic revolution, what was the role of Shia religion and identity in creating the momentum of the resistance movement? It's a massive question, Ali, but it would be really helpful, I think, to try and break all that down.
I will try and make it concise. Basically, there are three complementary, I would say, sort of ideological trends in modern Iran in that sense. So one of them is very clearly nationalism and a sort of a secular nationalism. But nationalism wasn't always seen as juxtaposed against religion. There were many nationalists who were very religiously devout. I think sometimes, in the academy, we like to sort of categorize people into very clean and tidy sort of groups. That's obviously not the case. There were people that would identify, I suppose, as nationalists. There were others who were very much more identified with the left in Iran. And then, the third group were what we might term, the Islamists in one way or form. But of course, all those three different groups tended to sort of overlap with each other. And there were various people who, there were different hues, if I can put it that way. There were different sort of shades of colour in terms of your political leaning. So in the earlier part of the 20th century, a lot of this was really driven by what we might term a stronger nationalist sense, driven by that. But then by the mid-20th century, the attitudes began to shift. You see the same thing really in the Arab world as well. That what you see is then people saying that, moving away from that sort of nationalism that might have been more liberal in outlook towards more radical positions coming from the left and the Islamic groups. And then what you find is that under the Shah in particular, there was a huge amount, because of course the environment is that of the Cold War, of course, let's not forget that. There's a huge amount of emphasis on really controlling what they consider to be the threat from communism and the threat from the left. And ironically, of course, then as a consequence of that, a less attention paid to what was going on in the mosques, shall we say. And so what you see is a growth really of Islamism, partly fostered by the state in a way or encouraged by it, but also a growth of what is often termed Islamic Marxism. So the sort of merger of the sort of the left and the Islamic groups. The Shah used to call this, the unholy alliance between the black and the red. I mean, that's what he would call it. And he'd said, this is the great threat to the country. And of course, for him, by 1977, 78, what was disastrous for him and his regime, of course, was the fact that the black and the red did come together. So the left and the Islamic groups sort of came together, and very much identified in some ways in the person of Ayatollah Khomeini himself, who drew on basically many left-wing ideas, actually, to articulate his case.
So what you're saying, I think, is that basically when the Shah tried to close down resistance in one form, it sort of squeezed it towards another form in a way. So it didn't reduce it. It just changed its shape.
So basically, there's this. The Shah doesn't see the threat as coming from the Islamic groups. I mean, he's quite devout himself, so he sort of thinks that he's promoting the religious culture of the country, but obviously not in the way that it emerges against him. This sort of a radical position against him. And what you see is this revolutionary movement that builds up really from the 60s and 70s in Iran, that in a sense merges the sort of religious right with the sort of secular left. You get a sort of a radicalization of Shiism reinterpreted with Marxist tropes of various sorts. So it's almost re-empowered by it. So Shiism traditionally has always been it's been quietist. It's tended not to be political. What you find in the 60s and 70s is Shiism becomes revolutionized in that sense. It becomes imbued with a lot of Marxist ideas. And then, of course, Khomeini himself used a lot of these ideas to re-energize Shiism as a sort of this sort of culture of martyrdom, self-sacrifice, working for the oppressed, and this sort of idea of the oppressed and the oppressors. It merges rather well with sort of Marxist doctrines as well, this anti-capitalist drive and others. I mean, they sort of feed off each other, if I can put it that way, and reinforce each other. So you found this situation where you had a lot of the Iranian students abroad in the United States and in Britain and other places who were agitating for revolution, very much almost exclusively sort of drawn to left-wing ideas, but then finding when they went back to Iran that actually these left-wing groups didn't quite have the traction that they thought they had, and a lot of it's being driven by the Islamist groups, in part because, of course, the Islamist groups have the sort of the structures in place. They have the network of mosques, they have the clerics, they have reach into the working class poor in a way that your sort of middle class left-wing rich kids in the West don't. I mean, they're not that connected. They may be sort of budding revolutionaries, but they're not really connected with the sort of the grassroots in the country.
So that's really helpful, Ali, because what you're describing there is essentially a socialist resistance movement that is enabled by a structure that already exists, but also a mindset which helps to sort of boost it. And I think that question about sort of Shia identity as being essentially, on the losing side, being the outsiders, being the underdog, is clearly a sort of a really important motivating factor in a movement that is seeking to motivate people to rise up and defend or rebel. Is that, who kind of instrumentalized that? Was that the Ayatollahs? Did it come from grassroots? How did the sort of movement grow?
Well, there were a number of movements. I mean, there were a number of left-wing movements, particularly, that were very active and quite well organized. I mean, I don't want to underestimate them at all. But they were, they had almost like a party political structure about them. They were probably smaller in number than the religious groups, but probably better organized to begin with, and in some ways formed the shock troops of the revolution. I mean, these were the armed guerrillas, if you can put it that way. And, they brought in many Islamic ideas to sort of essentially make Marxist ideas appealing to Iranians, if I can put it that way. So, obviously, if you follow a straightforward Marxist sort of revolutionary movement, people say, well, this is very atheistic. It's not really in tune with the culture of the country. So what you do is you sort of marry it, however awkward it might be, to Islam, and you say, actually, they're both the same thing, a bit like, Christian Democrats were Islamic Marxists, so it sort of works that way. Not that that's probably a bad example, because obviously I'm not saying Christian Democrats doesn't merge very well, but it's this idea that they can, that they can marry each other in a way that might be a little bit inconvenient, but it's not necessarily consistent, but it works. It works. It's an ideological fudge. And then, obviously, on the other side, what left-wing ideas did is they basically radicalized Islamic thought in some ways. It sort of empowered it in a way. So you have a number of what we would call lay religious thinkers. A very prominent one was Ali Shariati, who basically articulated a sort of a view of revolutionary Shiism, really without clerics, I have to say. I mean, he appealed to a lot of middle class because he wasn't really interested in Orthodox Shiism. He thought Orthodox Shiism was actually very state-orientated and very establishment-orientated. And really that to free itself from this, it had to free itself from these traditional structures. So he was very influential. But then, of course, clerics themselves were a number of quite interesting sort of clerical figures who essentially borrowed some of these ideas from the left and sort of integrated them into Shia thought to basically say, for instance, as I was saying earlier, in a way that, let's say, the culture of martyrdom in Shiism, well, this could be interpreted in the struggle of the oppressed against the oppressor, and this is a sort of a trope that both ideological prisms. So in that sense, it appeals to a broad range. And one of the things that Khomeini, you think of Khomeini in the late 70s, an old, bearded, clerical figure, what's his appeal to the youth of the country? Well, his appeal to the youth of the country is that he seems, on the one hand, as traditional as he is, he's also thoroughly modern. He sort of can say to them, well, I've read these works, I've read these books, I know what these people are saying, I know what these radical left-wing thinkers are saying, and, this is really all Islam. All we're doing is we're reimagining Islam in a different way, and I can lead that. So when he talks about, the great Satan is an extraordinarily clever trope in that sense, metaphor, if you will. So what it's both Islamic, because he's talking about the great tempter, but at the same time, he's also talking about the materialism of capitalist culture and what the United States represents. Their materialism drags you away from the natural spirituality that you should have. And therefore, in that single phrase, he appeals to both members of the left as well as Islamists. I mean, it's a clever way of basically squaring the circle.
That simplicity of the message is something which comes up again and again. Is how to craft your message so that you can mobilize people behind it, and the shorter and sweeter in a way, the better. What I think is also why it's worth digging into this a bit is because one of the explanations that we use nowadays to explain right-wing extremism in America or the growth of Islamist extremism across the Middle East is the role of the internet in conspiracy theories or recruiting, radicalizing people. But this was, of course, all completely pre-internet, and so what you're talking about, in a way, is a prototype. Is there anything else you can say about how they did that, how he managed to sort of distill down the message and to recruit? Because I imagine there was a large amount of people who would class themselves both as strongly Shia and as Iranian national people, but who weren't necessarily naturally predisposed to want a revolution. So how did he sort of tip that balance?
Well, there's a couple of things that we need to bear in mind. One is that a lot of these clerics are actually trained in rhetoric in that sense. I mean, a lot of their working life is preaching in that sense. So the good ones know how to tap in. But in order for these things to resonate, of course, you have to operate in a political system that's quite repressive. So the Pahlavi regime, certainly by the 1970s, was becoming increasingly authoritarian and increasingly repressive. And the problem with that is, of course, is that the people didn't trust the official sort of messages coming from government, and were therefore more willing to listen to other people. Even when I have to say, when the Shah and the government were actually telling you the truth, you refuse to believe it. At the height of the revolution, for instance, a very, very notorious incident called the Jali Square massacre, which was in autumn of 1978, and of course. The revolutionaries said that thousands of people had died. I mean, there was even sort of foreign reporters were saying how dreadful it was and so on and so forth, which, of course, it was a very bloody affair. The Shah's, the government said about 81 people or 82 people had lost their lives in this, in the clampdown, and the military had obviously shot into the crowd. Now, of course, nobody believed the figure of 81 or 82. I mean, everyone said this is such an underestimation and so on and so forth. It was only about 20 or 30 years later that the Islamic Republic and those actually, when they did a proper assessment, actually their own assessments were that the Shah was right. I mean, he'd actually, the government of the Shah of Iran had been honest. But of course, nobody was going to believe that. So people wanted to believe what they wanted to be. So there's a receptive audience. And of course, the other thing is that not only was this sort of ability to communicate effectively with the common people in language and other things that they would understand, but of course, Khomeini was famous, as were the clerics, for using what technology they had. And in those days, of course, it was the tape recorder, and they would record sermons and they would then, distribute. There was also this view, certainly by the Shah's regime, that many foreign news agencies were somewhat sympathetic with the revolutionaries, and therefore were often sort of acting as an amplifier of their message. And there was lots of criticism, for instance, of the BBC Persian service, who occasionally, I have to say, would then say, yes, Ayatollah Khomeini has said that people should rise up at the following time in the following place, and so on and so forth. And of course, people would then go, the BBC Persian service has spoken, ironically, given that, the way they view the BBC Persian service today. But in those days, it was seen as the voice of truth. So if they said that Ayatollah Khomeini had said something, they would tend to believe it. But of course, internally, there was this vast network. I mean, rumor is the wrong word, but there was a sort of a chain of communication that went from different cells throughout society. And of course, it encouraged, and a bit like Chinese whispers, by the time it gets down to the nth chain, it can change quite dramatically and become quite extraordinary. But nonetheless, it was a chain that was believed. I mean, that was the way it worked. And whatever the government did, because it just lacked any authority whatsoever, it wasn't going to punch through that.
So that question about who to trust and how to sow doubt, which we're still struggling with, in fact, struggling with probably more than ever. It's fascinating to see how central it was.
I mean, in many ways, it's become so much worse now.
So, yeah. Ali, let's move on to what happens when the radical resistance movement becomes the radical permanent government. So you could argue, I'm sure, you could argue that the Islamic Republic of Iran is as radical in its language now as it was in 1979, while at the same time it is a deeply conservative state. So this is quite an achievement. And I think the thing I'd really like to sort of look at is how it's managed to retain its anger and its energy and its power. And is this something that is only possible because it still sees itself in a state of resistance, particularly to the UK and the US, and that it's possible to have the IRGC and the Quds Force and the Basij simply because the resistance still needs to carry on? Or what's your view on how they've managed to sort of still be radical and rebellious after all this time?
Well, I mean, part of the reason, the way I see it anyway, is that they get stuck in some sort of loop effectively. I mean, they can't escape. So most people sort of assume that a revolutionary movement will eventually start to calm. It starts to rationalize itself. It starts to settle into government. We move from poetry to prose, and obviously it will aspire. It will hang in there with a bit of revolutionary rhetoric. But for all practical purposes, it's become a sort of a regular government. And you see that in Iran, actually, post the Iran-Iraq war, there is a move towards a sort of a rationalization of government procedure. And in Iran, because we have this dual power structure between essentially the republic and then the sort of revolutionary organizations around the revolution, there's this tension. But really, in the 1990s, you saw the sort of the institutions of the republic really sort of trying to settle into the driving seat and say, well, now we've achieved power. Obviously, we celebrate the revolution. The revolution is very important in terms of myth and memory and so on and so forth. But we're now moving into the good times. We want to make a bit of money and this sort of thing, and really become the government. The problem was because of these internal tensions, there were other groups, sort of more revolutionary groups, who also felt that this sort of settling down to having the good life and whatever was a bit of a betrayal of what the revolution was all about. And there were elements of truth in that, of course. I mean, there was some people who were benefiting a great deal from being in power that, to be honest, in terms of the aspirations of the revolution to deliver to the oppressed or to develop a democratic settlement or whatever, or to achieve various things, there was a huge dispute about what the revolution's aims were. There was a huge sort of disagreement, obviously, over the direction of travel in that sense and who should be the sort of beneficiaries of all this. And so ultimately, I think, what you see in Iran is a group of people on the more the more Islamic revolutionary side who develop almost a theory of continuous revolution. I mean, that's what, because it serves their interests, of course. It diminishes that sort of group of people who want a sort of republican settlement, so to speak, and a more normal government, and then emphasizes the fact that actually, we have an aspiration for the revolution. It's got nothing to do, by the way, with having a democracy or an Islamic Republic. It's to do with fulfilling an Islamic vision for the future, and we can go into some detail about what this Islamic vision may be. But it's quite I mean, it is pretty radical. It's pretty authoritarian. It revolves around the person of the supreme leader as the representative of the hidden imam in this world. So that's strongly Shia in its outlook. And of course, democracy and this sort of thing doesn't actually feature in all this. I mean, it doesn't think it's all about a sort of a spiritual redemption. And of course, what they do, there's two things that work in their favor. One is that you need to have a sort of a permanent enemy. So the great Satan, or global arrogance, or whatever you want to call it, the United States, the West, capitalism, whatever, becomes a permanent feature of that landscape, which is part of the raison d'etre of the revolution, by the way. I mean, they're there. And, the revolution will not be successful until the United States collapses, basically, which, this could go on forever. But, that suits them in that sense. On top of that, there's this sort of protracted vision of a sort of a goal that's so far in the future. It's almost millenarian in some ways, but we're never quite there. So you get these sort of members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps who talk repeatedly of the fact that we are on stage 2 of a 5-stage process to fulfill the promise of the Islamic Revolution. And, that's quite galling, I think, for a lot of Iranians, to be honest, that they're only on stage 2. I think they sort of thought, 42 years, they might be a good deal further along the road than that. But, of course, this is all about maintaining, that revolutionary zeal and power and keeping it going. So that's the way certainly in the Iranian case, I see the way in maintaining this revolutionary process.
Ali, thank you. That's really interesting. I'm curious about some of the more apocalyptic aspects of behind the philosophy of the revolution. And obviously this is prompted by my thinking about how Daesh used apocalyptic narratives of Sunni Islam to really sort of build their recruitment message and create the sense that the end of the world was coming, and it was the duty of you, a sort of devout Muslim, to be a part of it. Could you talk a bit more about the more millenarian aspects of Shiism that emerged over the course of the revolution? And actually, linking back to what you said, I'm really interested in that sense that if you have this kind of end of the world aspect to your narrative, it enables you to build in a response to setbacks, because in the journey towards the apocalypse, there are a series of setbacks. And again, you see that with Daesh, where it doesn't matter if this caliph doesn't survive, because he is not the last caliph anyway. And in order to get to the end of the world, we have to have a series of further caliphs. So how does that work in the Iranian context?
They certainly have this view, and they often argued for this, that the purpose of the Islamic Revolution, this is the sort of more hardline elements of the Islamic Revolution, is to create a world in which the hidden imam can return. So this is the end of time. And there will be, as you quite rightly say, there will be many ups and downs on this process. I mean, there will be many obstructions, but we will get there in the end. And actually, the person who articulated all this stuff very, very explicitly, of course, we all laughed at him, but he was telling us as he felt it, was Ahmadinejad. I mean, he was all over it. People would say, oh, it's all a bit of a joke and all that. Hey, he believed it. I mean, this, so I mean, even people in Iran thought he was a bit, wayward, but actually he represents a fairly good chunk of that revolutionary elite, who believe that it's all about the hidden imam. The hidden imam is there. And remember, with the hidden imam, the idea of the hidden imam is that not that he's not there, he's an occultation, and the whole purpose of occultation means he's there, but he's not seen. So only to his very special people can relate to the hidden imam, and that's obviously gives a certain amount of charismatic authority to those who can claim it. And of course, Ahmadinejad did claim that a couple of times, and he suffered for it because many of the clerics didn't like it. It's not uncommon, this sort of idea. It's what we might term not even might term, it's in my view superstition. I mean, it's an exercise in superstition, and many more orthodox clerics are appalled by it. But it's widely held by a number of a particular group of sort of revolutionary idealists, if I can put it that.
Just one final question now, to talk about resistance to the revolution, and you've alluded to that a few times, but given what you've just said about setbacks being baked into your narrative, so the setback itself doesn't mean the end of the revolution, it just means you have to prepare yourself for the next phase, or organize yourself for the next phase. So what about the growth of the pro-democracy movements in Iran? We saw last year what appeared to be significant demonstrations in support of or against the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, who was assassinated in Iraq. So there's still a portion of the population who continue fervently to support the revolution, but there is also a portion of the population who clearly don't. Is Iran becoming increasingly divided? And is it the case that we now have a radical resistance movement on both sides?
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think there are two narratives, and one is basically a narrative of revolutionary Islam, and the other is a narrative of democracy, if I can put it that way. Both of them are contested, but the fact is that one group believes, and they're mainly drawn from the left and the liberals and others, that the whole purpose of the Islamic Revolution was actually to bring democracy to the country. There's another group, that basically the people in charge at the moment, who believe that actually, no, the whole purpose of the Islamic Revolution was to create effectively an Islamic government. And democracy is a bit of a, it's a bit of a misnomer, and let's not get too het up about that. The interesting thing with Soleimani, if to go back to him, is of course a lot of Iranians mourned him because he was a nationalist figure. I mean, for them, they saw him as a nationalist figure, even though I don't think he would have seen himself as that. But many of them were shocked by it because he was seen as someone protecting Iran, believe it or not, obviously from Daesh and this sort of thing. But it's certainly true, I think, that there is a growth in Iran of those who actually think that the revolution has lost its way, that it's going down the wrong path. But at the moment, and certainly since 2009, when you had the last big outpouring of this sort of democratic impulse, if you will, it's been systematically hammered. I mean, it's had a very, very hard time. Its main leaders are in house arrest. Many others are imprisoned. I mean, basically, it doesn't have the sort of resources that allows it to challenge the dominant narrative at the moment. It's important to bear in mind, by the way, that many of those who are on the democratic side of things are not necessarily anti-Islamic Republic. They are in favour of the Islamic Republic and in favour of the Islamic Revolution, just a different one. I mean, this is the point. Now, there's also a case that there's quite a few people that are increasingly moving down the line that think that actually this sort of idea of reforming the system isn't going to work. Therefore, they're looking outside that system. But at the moment, they're not really being heard as much as they might have been even 20 or 25 years ago. But those tensions are definitely there. And in some ways, of course, the radical, more revolutionary Islamic element, it becomes part of their own narrative, of course, as you say, this constant challenge, tension, the threat, the enemy without, the enemy within, it's glorious stuff. I mean, it helps you basically define yourself and to maintain the revolution. So it's all part of that. It's all part of that revolutionary process for them.
So Ali, we're running out of time, but just a final question for you. The podcast is seeking to look at what it feels like to be on the losing side, and the people we haven't spoken about are the Iranians who were forced to leave after the revolution and are in exile. And for them, it's been a very long wait. So just quick final question. Do they still think that there is a future Iran that they can be part of?
Well, the interesting thing is that in sort of nationalist mythology, or the mythology of Iran in particular, there's been the history of the country has been so turbulent. There have been periodic times, throughout history when Iranians have had to go into exile and when they've lost elements of their identity, their statehood, if not their culture. And, one of the interesting things about Iranian culture is just how much of it is a literary culture. And it's part of an imagination, and it creates a very powerful imagination of belonging to Iran. And in that way, there is, even for those who have left or in exile. I mean, Khomeini himself was in exile, I think, for 14 years. He never thought he was going to go back, and then suddenly he turned up. He went back. I mean, obviously, the situation now is getting more and more, protracted, and one, thinks in some ways of the Russian, the white Russians after the Russian Revolution, who constantly, whether they would ever get back, and but presumably, some of them did after 70 years or so. I think there's definitely a yearning. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think there's definitely a yearning from those in exile to, for that hope that the country will settle, and at the very least allow for sort of connections to be remade. And I think, deep down, obviously, there are many sort of opposition groups abroad that would want something more radical to happen, a sort of either a return of the monarchy or a democratic settlement or whatever. One has to say that in the long span of Iranian history and the way in which people understand that, that all things at the end of the day are possible. I mean, it all depends really on how, things develop within Iran itself, and how those people abroad who, interestingly enough, when you look at the history of the Islamic Revolution, of course, a lot of the histories were written by the losers, because they all the ones who always went abroad and wrote, many accounts of their experiences. So, a lot of that, I think, in terms of shaping Iranian identity, it is quite interesting in that sense. There is a sort of a diaspora culture that I think is quite strong. It's not always connected with reality, but nonetheless, it does maintain a strong connection, identity, an attempted sort of relationship, which, one has to think, if we're taking the long view, that certainly there will be a possibility of a return.
Ali, thank you very much indeed. That's been fascinating, and I think it's nice to end on that wistful note. So very many thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast from Cambridge Geopolitics Conversations. You can find the Centre for Geopolitics on Twitter at @CamGeopolitics, and all our events are advertised online on our website at cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk.